When we talk about poverty, we often think of it as just a lack of money. But what if it's more complex? What if it's more like a trap? Today, we're going to explore the economic models that help explain why some people get stuck and what it really means to be vulnerable to falling into that trap in the first place.
Let's start with the human reality that sits behind all of these economic concepts. This quote from a mother during the COVID-19 pandemic really gets to the heart of it. You see, economic shocks create fears that go way beyond the crisis itself. They expose this daily fragility, and that fragility is really the definition of vulnerability.
So, to really understand this fragility, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll define the risk of falling behind. Then, we'll look at a powerful concept called the poverty trap model. From there, we'll explore the vulnerability zone, figure out how we measure this precariousness, and finally, we'll tie it all together to understand shocks and resilience.
Okay, let's dive right in. Before we can talk about traps and zones, we have to get really clear on what we mean when we use the word vulnerability.
So here's the crucial distinction. Vulnerability is not the same thing as being poor. It's the risk of becoming poor. It's all about how exposed a family might be to one of life's sudden, unexpected events, and, critically, whether they have the resources to cope when that event happens. Now, if vulnerability is a risk, how does that risk become a reality that's just so difficult to escape? Well, that brings us to our second section, the poverty trap model. It's a really powerful way that economists visualize this kind of vicious cycle.
This is what's known as a poverty trap. It's basically a cycle where poverty reinforces itself. One of the key drivers of this is something economists call human capital. Things like a person's education, their skills, even their health. If parents have low levels of human capital, it's incredibly hard for them to invest in their children's, which can potentially lock a family into poverty for generations.
Now, this graph might look a little complicated, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. That S-shaped curve just shows how a parent's human capital affects their child's. So, look at point B, down at the bottom. This is where low capital in one generation leads to low capital in the next. That's the poverty trap. Now look up at point G. Here, high capital leads to high capital. That's a stable, more prosperous state. The whole thing hinges on that tipping point, labeled T. If you start below it, you tend to slide back down to B. But if you can get above it, you have a chance to climb towards G.
A simpler way to visualize this is with the ball on a hill analogy. Think of the very top of the hill as that unstable tipping point. Any slight push sends the ball rolling down into one of two stable valleys, either the low human capital trap on one side or the high human capital equilibrium on the other. The final outcome just depends on which side of that tipping point you start.
That idea of a tipping point is absolutely crucial. So, for our third section, the vulnerability zone, let's see what happens when we apply this exact same model, but not to human capital, to something we're all a bit more familiar with, income. So instead of thinking about human capital, let's think about income. A household can find itself right at that tipping point, where a negative shock, say a job loss or a sudden medical bill, can push it down into a poverty trap. On the other hand, a positive shock, maybe a new job or a government cash transfer, might just be the thing that helps it reach the stability of the middle class.
And our ball on a hill analogy seems to work pretty well here too. Vulnerability is that unstable peak, balanced right between the two stable outcomes, the poverty trap and the middle class. A shock is what determines which way the ball is going to roll.
But here's where we find a problem with that simple model. It makes it seem like escaping poverty is as easy as just rolling downhill into the middle class. The reality, as we're about to see, is actually a much, much tougher climb.
This is a much more accurate model. Notice the shape here. Vulnerability isn't a sharp single peak anymore. It's a wide, upward-sloping zone. And that shape gives us a crucial insight. Escaping poverty is a long, difficult climb. But a single negative shock can send a household sliding all the way back down to the bottom.
So, if vulnerability is this precarious zone, how do we actually go about identifying and measuring it across an entire population?
Well, economists use income distribution graphs, just like this one, which shows some data for Colombia in 2023. What it does is map out the percentage of the population at each level of per capita income. And you can see right away, most of the population is clustered down at the lower income levels.
Now, to analyze this, we draw three key lines. First, there's the extreme poverty line, which marks the income needed just to survive. Then there's the poverty line, which is what's needed for basic necessities. And finally, we have the vulnerability line. Anyone with an income below this line has a 50% or higher chance of falling into poverty if they experience a shock.
That group, stuck between the poverty and vulnerability lines, is who we identify as the vulnerable. This comparison shows the impact of a large-scale shock so clearly. On the right, you can see the entire income curve has shifted to the left. That shaded area represents that large group of people who were in the vulnerable category and have now been pushed into poverty by the shock.
And all of this brings us to our final point. What does this mean for building resilience against these kinds of shocks?
So the key takeaway here is that vulnerability is really a state of high risk. It isn't just about having a low income. It's about living in a precarious position where a household's ability to withstand these unexpected events is severely limited. That makes it all too easy to fall into a poverty trap that is incredibly difficult to escape.
This analysis and the models we've explored today are based on research that has been published by Core Econ.
So this leaves us with a critical question. Understanding these models is the first step. The real challenge, though, is figuring out how to use this knowledge to build systems that create genuine resilience. Systems that can help people make that long climb into security and ensure that when shocks inevitably come, they can withstand them instead of being pushed right back over the edge.